How we doing, Jets fans? I'm Glenn Naughton with JetNation Radio and JetNation.com. Be sure to log into JetNation.com where you can register and become a part of what is the most active Jets message board on the web. Legal tampering period, folks, just a few days away. Teams are clearing salary cap space to make room for brand new free agents. And there's some trade possibilities emerging for the Jets and other teams as other clubs look to clean things up. Specifically, flying solo tonight, by the way, Dylan and Chris both had prior engagements, but they will be back next week. So let's start off with the Jets. A recent move the Jets made in the last few days. Not surprising. CJ Uzama gets let go. CJ Uzama, a tight end who was brought in a couple of years ago, ends up with like 29 catches, 39 catches, whatever it was, over his first two seasons. Huge, huge disappointment. I said when Uzama was signed, after going back and watching every single catch he made as a Cincinnati Bengal the previous year, um, the signing didn't thrill me, and my take was kind of unless they have a plan to use him differently than Cincinnati did. If he may be capable of more than what we saw with the Bengals, he may turn into something. Now he didn't. He struggled. He didn't do a whole lot here. But the thing with the Jets, as is always the case, is that offensively, very few guys do anything while they're here. You get the exceptions, the elites, the Garrett Wilson, Bryce Hall's, Brees Hall, and with his playmaking ability, you see these guys who probably would have succeeded anywhere. But when it comes to developing lower end guys or middle round players, late round players, mid level free agents, not a lot going on at One Jets Drive. We've seen it time and again. I would wholly expect CJ Uzama. I'm not saying he's going to go out and have a 1,200-yard season next year, but wherever he lands, I would say there's a better than average chance that he will have a decent year next year and look better than he did with the Jets, because that's what everybody does. Um, so he's gone, but one guy, another cap move that we saw another club make, and it opened a lot of eyes. I know I right away thought, oh, bring him back. And right away you saw it on Twitter, whether it was the fans, the beat writers. But Foley Fatukasi, the old Mike McCagnon draft pick out of UConn, one of his few picks, probably his best day 3 pick off the top of my head. So Foley Fatukasi, listen, the Jets need a run-stopping DT. We know this. Fatukasi would fit the bill there. But Joe Douglas, aside from free agency and player acquisition there, he's gonna have to get in. He's gonna have to get involved with a team like the Denver Broncos, or he's at least gonna have to try. And why is that? Of course, we know the Broncos let go of Russell Wilson. They are taking on the biggest cap hit in NFL history. I believe $80 million over 2 years of dead money that the Broncos are going to absorb. So that means what? The Broncos are probably going to be looking to shop some players. We've seen Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy mentioned as possibilities. Should the Jets go in and try to trade for either one of those guys? Of course, that would make sense. To me, I'm going to call too, and I'm going to say, what's it going to take to get Garrett Bowles involved in this deal? And I know there have been comments and quotes that the Broncos won't be looking to deal Bowles. They're going to have to free up some cap space. This is a very deep offensive tackle class. I know they need a quarterback too. But if they're looking to shed cap and still be able to field the team, I don't think. Listen, Garrett Bowles isn't Anthony Munoz. I don't think he's a player that the Broncos could, not live without if they were to let him go and add a young tackle in this draft class, get younger, cheaper at the position, while the Jets could try to add a body in a critical position of need. And I asked it earlier on Twitter, what would you be willing to give up if you're Joe Douglas? What are you willing to trade to get a starting tackle in Bowles and a number 2 receiver to go along with Garrett Wilson, whether it's Sutton or Jeudy? Obviously, if you're the Jets, you should be making calls and you should be very interested. The only downside here, and we've talked about it this offseason, the Jets don't have a ton of draft capital, and the Jets aren't in the basically it's free. It doesn't matter. Free agency, trade, other teams are going to come knocking, and the Jets aren't really going to have the draft capital to probably match an offer that another team is more willing to make. Maybe like a Baltimore who might want to add a receiver. Jets don't have the draft capital they have to make a deal, so that's going to make it problematic. And the same goes for free agency. We've talked about it on the show. We've talked about it a lot. But now as free agency creeps closer, it becomes more of a reality for Jets fans to look at this team, look at this situation as free agency approaches. having it, your number one need entering free agency is offensive line. A lot of teams need offensive line, and not every team has a guy, as the Jets do, have an offensive line coach and Keith Carter, who's not very popular among offensive linemen around the league. We've talked about it. We've talked about Taylor Lewan. We've talked about Mekhi Becton. We've talked about, Brees Hall's a running back, and he's on Twitter making fun of the offensive line coach. So this is something that's going to be a problem. Like I said, we discussed it last week, and with free agency now, legal tampering is just around the corner. Teams are going to be allowed to make calls, make offers, and if you're the Jets and you're calling somebody, you're going to have to convince them that anything bad you've heard about Carter isn't, don't believe it. You're going to want to come here and listen. I understand money is king, cash is king, right? But even if you outbid guys, we saw Joe Douglas outbid the Miami Dolphins for Tyreek Hill, and Tyreek Hill still went to the Dolphins. You can't force dudes to play for you. So Joe Douglas could enter this sequence, this offseason, or in the next sequence of events where they're going to start offering money to guys. All Joe Douglas can do is bid. And if he's making monster bids to really good players, because there are some good offensive linemen out there, they're free to say no. They're free to say, you know what, Joe, I appreciate it, but either the offer is comparable and I'm going to go somewhere with much lower taxes, so that's going to be a couple extra million a year, or the offer is comparable, but the taxes are lower or about the same, but you know what, that team I think is a lot closer to winning, or the offer is comparable, even bet you beat it, but you know what, I'm an older guy, I want to win, and I've heard enough about your O-line coach that I know I don't want to play for him. So the Jets and Joe Douglas have a lot working against them this offseason. The fact that Douglas himself is likely on the hot seat, Robert Saleh on the hot seat. These are guys who may not be back next year. And this is something that, again, some players do look for that. Some players want that stability. They want to know that they're signing in a place where there's not going to be an overhaul next season. Oh, sorry about that. Where there's not going to be an overhaul next season. And that player and everybody else is out looking for a job somewhere else. So it's between having a team that hasn't been competitive of late, having a GM who could be on the way out, having a head coach who could be on the way out. And then you get into the whole, the MetLife Stadium thing. We've heard comments that a lot of players don't like the turf. David Bakhtiari has commented on it. And he's another guy, another free agent that, I wanted to discuss because you see his name floating. Listen, I fully expect the Jets to make an offer to David Bakhtiari because Aaron Rodgers is still here. And I would imagine, even if Aaron Rodgers doesn't get as much control and influence as he had last year, which he may, that remains to be seen. I don't expect it to be quite as much. But even if it's limited, even if Aaron Rodgers has less say than he had last year, you would imagine David Bakhtiari, one of his best friends, is going to be the guy that he goes to bat for. And Bakhtiari, the injury history there, adding him should change nothing, basically. You don't sign him and then say, okay, well now offensive line, offensive tackle moves down our list of priorities. No, you can't count on the guy to play. The Cowboys, of course, with Smith, they're letting him go. And, after 13 years, a bunch of All-Pros, a bunch of Pro Bowlers and all that. And I'm not on board with bringing in these guys who have extensive injury, older guys with extensive injury histories. I can't get my head around it. I honestly can't. How are you a New York Jets fan who just watched them cycle through 14 different linemen, 11 different lineups, and you're saying, let's go get this dude who misses 8-9 games every other year? Again, get him, fine. Listen, you want to bring him in if he's willing to come in for vet minimum? But again, why would anyone right now, except Bakhtiari, who might want to play with his best buddy, why would any other lineman come here for less than, a big payday or for less than what they could command on the market when the Jets have so little else to offer? Like, generally, when veteran players are willing to take less money, it's because the place they're going offers something else that other places don't. Like, for example, if you're a free agent, you get a call from the Jets, and you get a call from the Chiefs, and you get a call from the Ravens, and you get a call from the Dolphins. Where all other things being equal, or I should say financially being equal, where are you going to go? You're going to go to the Chiefs where they're trying to win their, fourth Super Bowl in 5 years. You're going to go to the Dolphins where the money might be the same on paper, but you're getting a couple extra million because of the taxes. You're going to go to Baltimore where you feel like they're knocking on the door, or you're going to go to the Jets. Well, if you're going to go to the Jets, you're going to have to say, look, Joe Douglas, I'm going to need an extra 10, 12 million tacked onto that deal. If you want me to turn my back on Super Bowl contenders and deep playoff run teams and teams where I'm going to make a little more money with the tax situation. And so you might, again, Bakhtiari maybe, but the free agents we discussed last week, there are a lot of good guards out there. And this is the problem the Jets are going to run into, again, be it free agency, be it trade. You're going to be competing with other teams who have more to offer. And Joe Douglas, he can offer money. But that's about it. And he can offer the opportunity to play with Aaron Rodgers. That was sort of the conclusion we came to. Isn't Joe Douglas, J.E. says, isn't Joe Douglas an Orion guru? Find some hidden gems. I'm sure, listen, I don't think it's just going to be first round. I mean, I like that Joe Douglas has used the early picks on the O-line. It sure would have been nice if some of these O-line guys would have stayed healthy. Honestly, the first gem I thought he found, guy who I loved watching him in college, I've discussed him before, was Cam Clark. Wild Wave, how we doing, buddy? Hawk says Donovan Smith's a Jet fan. Yeah, but he's washed. I mean, he just played in the Super Bowl as a backup. Maybe you bring Donovan Smith on, but other than that, Tyron and Bakhtiari, again, those guys. If you bring those guys in, that changes nothing. You still need a dependable offensive tackle to bring in, and if you're Joe Douglas, you've got to be aggressive. But again, you can't force them, right? You couldn't force Tyreek Hill to come here, but there will be guys. And this has been my fear, and this is what I've talked about. I think the Jets are going to end up with the mid to lower tier guys where there's not a lot of competition. Because if you're the Jets and you have a lot of competition for a player, there are a lot of teams who have more to offer. The only hope you might have is a team that isn't viewed as a playoff contender, doesn't have an elite quarterback, which you're hoping you have with Aaron Rodgers. And by that, I mean in terms of health. Is Aaron Rodgers going to stay healthy next year? That's my biggest concern regarding him because, and this isn't just about Aaron. You look around the league and guys just don't stay healthy. It is so rare for quarterbacks to play a full season, let alone a 41-year-old quarterback coming off a ruptured Achilles. I think it would be madness to assume he's just come in and assume he's going to play 17 games. The expectation should be that he's going to miss time, but it comes down to how much time and when. That's okay, let's say, he gets a 2 or 3 week injury. But if that happens in week 17, season could be over. And that's where Joe Douglas is going to have to be aggressive in the backup quarterback market. Whether it's going after Jacoby Brissett or Gardner Minshew, somebody along those lines. And you got to grab one in the draft. Like the Jets, I know teams don't like carrying 3 quarterbacks, but I feel like the Jets kind of have to next year. You don't know how many more years you're getting out of Rodgers. You got to have a backup in place, and you got to have someone to develop behind them. Aaron says, I'm fine with Bakhtiari as long as he's just a backup, not a... Exactly, Aaron. That's my point. If you're going to bring Bakhtiari in, which you probably are, then fine. Bring him in. Don't overpay, for God's sakes. Don't give him a $14 million deal. And you don't make him any promises. You say, look, you can come in here. You can compete for a spot. You might play. You might not. But we're still drafting a tackle. Well, we're assuming it's going to be tackle at 10. But Aaron Rodgers is going to, I would imagine, have some say that. I've heard people say the Jets aren't taking a tackle because Aaron Rodgers doesn't like playing with rookie offensive linemen. He might not have a choice. I mean, they need multiple offensive linemen. They will make offers to veteran offensive linemen. They may not get anyone who's a day one definite starter in free agency. You might get some depth pieces. And then the next option is the draft, where you're going to grab some rookies. And luckily, this is just, it's such a tough year to only have that one first rounder, to only have one, to not have a second rounder, I should say. Because if you're a team like the Jets and you need multiple starters, you can probably find 2 stars. I've said before, I think if you stay inside the top 40, you probably find 2 guys who you could be comfortable starting. Whether it's a Cooper Beebe or somebody like that in round 2, Christian Haynes, Cooper Beebe, guys like that. Patrick Paul may fall out of the first round. I think he will. I think Patrick Paul at tackle will fall out of the first round, but there are guys who you would be able to get in round 2 with that pick if you had it, that you as the Jets could feel comfortable saying, we think we've got 2 day one starters. Think back to, Mangold and Brick. How many times have Jets fans said that? Get back to the Mangold and Brick thing where you have 2 young guys to build around who will be in place for 10 years. That's the opportunity the Jets, as of right now, don't have because they don't have those picks. I keep in my mind, I've said before, right? Tag and trade Bryce Huff. Didn't happen. that deadline came and went. And listen, don't forget, we've talked about, well, if you let Bryce Huff go, you get the comp pick next year. If you're big C fishing, or you're shopping in the first wave of free agency and you're adding big ticket guys, they cancel each other out. So Bryce Huff could walk out the door. You could end up with nothing in the end if you sign a couple of really. All you got to do is sign one guy that slips into that same category that he does, and there goes that comp pick. So really, the Jets, if they weren't going to make a serious run at Huff, and they still have a couple days, and they've said publicly they're negotiating. It doesn't sound like the Jets are taking the Huff situation that seriously, which would lead you to believe, they should have had this done last year. Is when a lot of us were saying, get this guy re-signed. The Jets didn't re-sign him. He has a monster year. Mike Lombardi, I believe, former NFL GM. Now, a lot of his stuff is very, and I mentioned this to Dylan. Dylan has Dylan had the same response, like, not the biggest Jets fan. Lombardi has a lot of negative stuff, and I'm not one of these like the media's coming after us, because the Jets do a lot of stuff that's worthy of being criticized. But Lombardi said, and he said he wouldn't reveal the team, which of course you wouldn't, because they would be losing a draft pick for you outing them. But Lombardi claimed that Huff already has a deal in place with the team, that somebody is giving him a big payday, and Bryce Huff is already gone. That the second free agency starts, Bryce Huff is going to have a new team. He's already, didn't say, I guess technically has agreed to terms, but of course that would be done covertly, and nobody cares. You may as well just start free agency the second the Super Bowl ends, because there's ways to let teams know you're interested, let players know you're interested, back channels and things like that. So let's see, Wild Wave. Zach isn't good if you're getting. Oh, is it okay? So that we're talking about Joe Douglas has been horrible except one draft. I disagree. I've said it before. I think the injuries have been the biggest issue for Joe Douglas. I think we've got a lot of starters on this team, or I think the Jets have a lot of starters and backups on this team who were not part of that draft class. I think when you look at Joe Tippmann, when you look at Michael Carter is one of the best nickel corners in the league. When you look at the development, I think Jamie Sherwood is a guy who's going to take that step next year and is going to see a lot of playing time. We did see some improvement this year from Bryce Hall and Ashton Davis in the secondary. Will they be back? That remains to be seen. But those guys were solid players. So I think between injuries, injuries have been the biggest thing. And I'm not saying Douglas hasn't missed. Of course he's missed. But he's had more than one good draft. I think this most recent draft, I think McDonald's going to be a player. I think Tippmann's going to be a player. I think Carter Warren at worst is going to be a sort of backup swing tackle for you for a few years, which isn't a bad use of a pick. I think Izzy Abanikanda, been put in the right spot in the right role, I think is going to be a good player. So I think Douglas is at, his first draft was obviously the biggest blemish there is that the Becton injury, but we did see, as I said, Davis and Hall come on this year. So even if you get a couple of backups, that's not a great draft, but as Jets fans, we know we've seen far, far worse. Let's see in the chat. Zach isn't good. Let's talk about Zach. This is of course going to be. Here we go. No, this is going to be a situation where the Jets are looking to offload a guy who's got a lot of talent. I think there will be some interest. I think teams that saw Zach pre-draft will understand that he's been with the Jets, and this is what the Jets do to quarterbacks. They make them look a lot worse than they are. The big question is just going to be what can you get for Zach? Because I feel like when you look at the Jamal Adams, oh, by the way, Jamal Adams out there who wants to go knock on that guy's door and bring him back in the locker room to import a guy who's all about himself and will just be a cancer for the rest of the locker room. Which the Jets, according to Connor Hughes, have no interest, and that would be my expectation. I don't see how you'd be in the middle of trying to build something special and bring Jamal Adams into your locker room. That would just be disastrous. So no Jamal. But where was I? With the Zach trade, with Jamal, with Sam Darnold, with Chris Herndon, Blake Cashman, like these are guys that people thought Joe Douglas would get little to nothing for. And he actually turned them into something. In the case of Darnold and Jamal Adams, multiple ones and twos. Who's the safety? They got that safety in the deal with Seattle, only here for a year. I forget his name. So basically the point is Joe Douglas has made a lot of trades in the past where he got far more than anybody, myself included, thought he would get. But in the case of Zach Wilson, Some people are saying you're going to get a swap of sixths or a swap of sevenths. I mean, I'm not ruling it out. It would just that would surprise me because I think Zach, I think his profile was high enough, and there was a lot of talk prior to that draft that Zach was the consensus number two. It's not. I mean, listen, all these people with the Jets drafted him because of his pro day throw. Those people just don't like. It's like you get a group of people who don't pay attention, and they just read one or two quotes, one or two hot take, silly quotes that someone else who doesn't pay attention says, and then it just gets repeated till it becomes quote unquote true. But that wasn't true then, isn't true now. Zach Wilson was viewed as the number two, the consensus number two quarterback in that draft class behind Trevor Lawrence. So what you need is one team, I mean, ideally two, but you need at least one team where there's an offensive coordinator or a head coach who's sitting there going, man, I thought that dude would be, I thought he was the next big thing. It turns out he went to New York and he, had to work with Nate Hackett and no offensive line. Definitely was put on the field too early. Joe Douglas has said as much. So is there a team out there that says this guy was the number 2 overall pick? We'll part with an early day 3 pick. We'll part with a 5. Maybe we'll part with a 4 if it's Zach and a 5, something like that. Which again, neither would surprise me. If the Jets got a 6 or 7, I wouldn't be shocked. If they got a 4 or a 5, I wouldn't be shocked. I'm not one of these people that's just says there's absolutely no way they get more than a 7 for Zach Wilson. But we'll find out. And look, I would be surprised if the Jets got nothing for Zach. I've heard people say that no one's going to give up anything for Zach Wilson, and I'm just thinking no one's going to give up again. I mean, we've seen guys bounce back. How bad did Geno Smith look? And I'm not saying a team wants to trade for Zach and have him sit and learn for 7 years the way Geno had to. Let's see. Hawk says nobody's going to take Zach's contract in a trade. So if we're going to pay him anyway, why cut him? Let some other team reap the benefits. I think it's just the two sides have reached an agreement, right? We saw the report that Saleh told Zach he would be dealt, which I think, sometimes it's just it gets to a point where it's time. Regardless. Now, the Jets are. I'm trying to think of another way to put it, but it's time. That's the point they're at with Zach Wilson. Whether you liked him or not. And I love the Zach pick. I loved Zach in college. I watched every single throw he made in college. I thought he was going to be a really good player. Obviously didn't work out here. As a Jets fan, you can't look, I can only speak for myself, right? But I look at that Houston game. I look at that, the Philly and KC games, and I think to myself, again, as I said, as Joe Douglas said, like they rushed him. He played too early, and he's still very young. Like this could be a kid that turns it around and has a good career. And you worry about that happening because you don't want to deal guys, get nothing in return, and then have them play at a high level. But sometimes you get put in a situation where you have to take that risk. I think that's where the Jets are right now. I think Zach probably, listen, and like I said, I like Zach, like the pick, wanted him as the pick. But the fact that he gets that end of season concussion that takes way longer to clear up than anybody else or than you see on average, I could see it being a thing where they were like, look, man, we're just, if you don't want to go out there, we're not going to put you out there. And it gives Zach an easy way to just say, I need 3-4 weeks for this concussion. So I'm out. And so he's gone. Zach was horrible. I would argue everything was horrible. And of course, it always looks worse for the quarterback because he's handling the ball every play. He's the one making all the throws. But just about everything was horrible. As we've all said, 11 different O-line combinations, 14 different O-linemen, literally starting undrafted free agent types, or sorry, I should say undrafted free agents who were practice squad types as your primary blockers for weeks at a time. Zach, I don't think any quarterback would have succeeded behind this line. I guess that's my point. We saw them clean up a little bit late in the year. I think that had something to do with Carter Warren coming in. Again, I'm not putting Carter Warren in as a day one starter, but I feel like he helped, stabilize the offensive line a little bit. Anthony, salute to you. Thank you. Let's see. Also wanted to touch on, we already talked about Foley Fatukasi and, the possibility of him coming back. The Jaguars cut him to create trade cap space. The Jets cut CJ Uzomah to create cap space. What else can the Jets do now in the coming days to create space? See a lot of news about maybe extensions or restructures. I don't know if you want to restructure CJ Mosley. A lot of people flip out when people suggest the Jets might part ways with CJ Mosley. I mean, there's no evidence of it. They're not gonna publicly tell us, hey, in the next couple of weeks we're gonna let go of CJ Mosley. And I don't feel like they will, but I won't be as surprised as other people if they do. I see a lot of folks who are like, there is no way in hell you part ways with CJ Mosley. And I think, well, the way you part with CJ Mosley is if it's a $10 million cap savings, 17 million if it's post June 1st, but that's only going to apply to your later moves. But if it's going to free up 10 million, and if you feel like you can get a little bit younger at the position, of course you're going to lose that leadership piece that CJ Mosley brings. But I think they have some young linebackers and could draft one. Again, I don't think they'll draft one early enough to replace CJ. So I'm not saying they're cutting CJ Mosley. I just wouldn't be shocked if they did. And a lot of people, I saw someone pitch it the other day. I saw a tweet saying, what will the Jets do with CJ Mosley? And like the responses were like, there is no way in hell. And I'm thinking, you got to create cap room. CJ's not a young dude, but I think Salah's loyal enough to him. I think Salah would pound the table to keep CJ Mosley around, even though he has lost a step. And he's gonna be a guy who's gonna struggle in coverage a little bit from time to time. Although I will say he was better in that area this year than I experienced. Let's see. JD selected Zach with a small sample in a weak conference and six. Yeah, that wasn't why he took him. That's Anthony. That, all due respect, that's just ridiculous. That didn't happen. They didn't take him because we're throwing shorts. They took him because he was the most accurate downfield deep ball passer in college football. He did it against USC. He did it against Tennessee. So he did play some big time programs. He didn't look any different. Go back to the Tennessee games. BYU had a bunch of drops earlier on. He probably would have played even better in that game. So he showed he can make every single throw. He was as accurate as anybody in the country on downfield throws. He had mobility. And there's a reason why he was regarded. Again, this has been mentioned several times. I've heard some good friends of mine mention it on their podcast. I've seen it written, I've seen it mentioned in articles. Pre-draft, Charlie Casserly spoke to like 18 teams, and whatever the number was, 18 or 20, and I think all but one, if not all, had Zach Wilson as QB2 in that class. So the notion that he did everything he did on the field, and the example I bring up all the time, because people always say level of competition, which I understand is a thing, but for those of you old enough to remember, and I use this example because it was the first time I saw it, and it was so surreal. Steve McNair played at Alcorn State, and he was so good that ESPN would cut away from whatever they were covering and break to a Division II college football game to watch Steve McNair throw the football. And he was a very good pro. So it's not like you could say, oh, well, this guy played at a small school, so he can't play. That's not the case. And Zach Wilson was absolutely lights out at BYU. Had zero stability here, had zero offensive line. And we'll see. Well, look, I wish the kid luck. I don't have anything against Zach Wilson. I understand the fans who are fed up because you can only watch it so many times before you're ready to move on. So I understand. But I think Zach Wilson takes more heat than he should get. But it really doesn't matter because the Jets are going to move on from him. He's going to go somewhere else. But he certainly wasn't drafted based on a pro day throw indoors. He was number one or number two on teams' draft boards before any pro days took place. Let's see, Hawk. CJ is the only real leader in the locker room. Well, we got to see who else comes in. I don't know that I would say Quinnen's not a leader. I think Sauce is becoming one. Sauce is still a young guy. J.E. Mosley's slow. He is. And that's the thing. As he's getting a little longer in the tooth, like, can you count on him having another year like that? When guys get to his age, he could go from having a good year to, like, losing it like that. And then just overnight, he's not there. Bad example, I remember. Why is it a bad example, Anthony? The example is you can play at a small school at a high level and succeed in the NFL. That's a perfect example. And yeah, Aaron McNair, and they used to break away from whatever games they were covering. And yeah, exactly, Anthony. And that's where Joe Douglas has acknowledged. Anthony says McNair sat for 2 years, and that's kind of what the point Joe Douglas acknowledged earlier this year when he said, look, we probably played Zach earlier than we should have. So Zach is still young enough to bounce back. As I said, the McNair example shows that quarterbacks can play at a high level, at a high level of play, at a low level of competition, and still succeed. So, and yeah, there you go. Wild Wave, great shout there. Josh Allen came from Wyoming, and he looked rough early on, and people joked that he was a running back, not a quarterback, and Josh Allen, was never going to make it. He was a guy that I looked at and said, you know, I'm sure I cracked the occasional joke after his first or second year when he was doing so much running. But I said when he was drafted, I said I don't know if this kid's going to be good, but I'm certainly not writing him off. Like, the guy literally can throw the ball through a brick wall from 50 yards out. He could run like hell. He could throw it on the run. There was enough there that you could see with Josh Allen, there was something to work with. Even if you wanted to, bust chops with Bills fans and go back and forth and make fun of him. I said when he was drafted, I was like, I don't get what everyone's laughing at. I understand the doubts, but I also understand what people see and what he could be. And if he becomes that, no Jets fans are going to be laughing, which is certainly the case now. Trade DJ Reed foolish. I saw somebody say that. Yeah, I wouldn't. Listen, I said this last year, and we've discussed it on our show. If I was the Jets last year, one option I would have explored. I mean, I made it clear I wanted Jackson Smith and Jigba at the top of that first round at receiver. But I would have traded DJ Reed last offseason and then used my first round pick on Joey Porter Jr. I mentioned that to Dylan Terman once or twice. I didn't even say it on because look, sometimes there's stuff you say on the air, and I never want to give the impression that I'm doing clickbait stuff. And that almost, because he's a high-level starter, I know there would have been people like, oh, clickbait, clickbait, clickbait. So I just kind of kept it off the air, and I said to Dylan, I was like, if I'm the Jets, if I can get a 3 for DJ Reed and draft Joey Porter Jr. and pair him with Sauce and add a third-round pick, I would do it. And, from what I was told, Porter had a little rough start to this year, but then was fine after that. And it's nothing against DJ Reed. I think DJ Reed's going to be a great player. Who else is going to be a great player? NFL Draft, NFL Combine just wrapped up down in Indianapolis. Some winners coming out of there. A guy, I'll tell you what, we talked draft a week earlier on the show, and I didn't even mention his name, but I'm probably a year or two ago, and I got the receipts, I got the tweets, I've tweeted about him before the second college season. The guy who won the combine, right? Xavier Worthy, breaking the all-time 40 record, running a 4.21. Worthy is a guy, we hear people throw around the term prospect fatigue. Like, oh God, we've been talking about that guy for so long, we don't even mention him anymore. And a few days before the combine, I was like, that Xavier Worthy is in that category for me. Because I've been a big Worthy guy for 2+ years. And I kind of was like, in my mind, I'm like, all right, he's already a guy I would take in the top 50. But I don't really discuss him anymore because I feel like I've been talking about him for a couple of years. But then he goes out, and good for him, man. Good. Look, Xavier Worthy, you got to figure he's a round 1 pick now. He's not a guy that would be on the board even if the Jets got a second-round pick. And somebody said, who was it? John Ross, the receiver that the Bengals took. I've seen a few people. Someone on the forums at JetNation did the whole, oh, John Ross ran a fast 40 and he sucked. And da da da. Xavier Worthy isn't John Ross. Like, Xavier Worthy can play. One of the things I remember most about John Ross, even at the time, was the number of people who were kind of like, oh, this guy, the Bengals just got fleeced. The Bengals just got duped by a good 40 time because this guy does not deserve to be picked there. Let's see. Steve Smith at Troy Fling in a terrible combine. Yeah, well, and that's a point with Worthy. Listen, Ross, that's many years ago. That was probably pre-YouTube. It's not like you had a ton of film on him. But if you go back, if you watch Xavier Worthy on game days, like, again, perfect player, no, nobody is. That's what drives me nuts when you mention a prospect and someone automatically throws, but he can't do this well. He can't do that well. Right. None of the prospects do everything well, and there's really no veterans who do everything well. Minus a couple of guys, and they go to the Hall of Fame. And even those guys might have some holes in their game, but Xavier Worthy is a guy who, he can beat you deep, but he's a good enough route runner that he can, he's going to make some catches underneath. He's going to make big plays as a punt returner. Big win for him running that 4.21. I think Worthy is a guy that, he's not a guy who came into the combine as an unknown and then ran a 4.21 and everyone's saying this guy needs to go in the first round. No, he was a guy who came into the combine as a late round 1, early round 2 projection, who also ran a 4.21 that made you say, oh, this guy might even be better than, like, the first time I watched Xavier, and I recommend it. I've told people this. It's very random, but I'm telling you right now, If you're bored sitting around one day, you have nothing else to do, and you want to watch a little football, and you want to watch a good football game that you haven't already seen, and that's obviously only if you haven't seen it. The Red River rivalry from Xavier Worthy's freshman year at Texas was the first game I ever watched him in. That is one of the best football games you will ever watch in your life. And Xavier Worthy, I think, had 9 catches for 264 and 3 touchdowns or something like that. Double or triple overtime. Just that was one of those games that I'm watching as a fan, or that I'm sorry, that I'm not watching as a fan. I'm watching to create, to create draft content and watch prospects. And I find myself forgetting that I'm watching prospects, and I'm just getting into the game because it's that good. But Xavier Worthy blew it up that day. I believe DeMarvion Overshone had a really big day. The linebacker who ended up going to the Cowboys. Red River rivalry, Oklahoma versus Texas from 3 seasons ago. Watch that game. If you are a football fan and you've not seen it, you will thank me for it later because that was something else. So again, Xavier Worthy had himself a really big day. Another guy that, again, probably has propelled himself into the top. Well, he has propelled himself into the top 50. We talked about him at and after the Senior Bowl, before the Senior Bowl a little bit. Braden Fisk from Florida State, a guy who, at least for me, seeing him in person in Mobile, I thought, wow, this guy's a lot quicker off the ball than I realized. My whole thing with watching him on film and liking him was that you thought he's quick enough and the motor is off the charts. And then you see him in person, and you're like, the quickness is kind of off the charts too. And he's got the motor to match. So he's going to be a very disruptive player in the middle of somebody's defense for a long time. Braden Fisk, Florida State. Now, the guy who I've watched the least of, and you know what? Since I'm bringing him up now, I'm going to watch him tonight. When I log off and we're off the air, I'm going to pop on some Georgia film and watch Amarius Mims. I have watched him, but he only started 8 games at Georgia. Did he win or lose at the combine? I felt like he won because of the physicals. Looked like someone you sculpt out of a. If you have a sculptor make you the ideal football player who's a tackle, like that's what you're going to get. He ran well, he moved well, but what happens? He comes in with an injury, with a knock on that he's injury prone, and he tweaks a hamstring during his 40 and can't finish the drills. And you're looking at it going, did this guy just have the best day or the worst day at the combine? Because what he was able to do, way up here, elevates him on your draft board, you would imagine. But if you're sitting there going, man, can this guy stay healthy? And then you look up and he's pulling up lame with a bad hamstring. Listen, folks, generally speaking, you get one first rounder. And especially if you're picking in that top 5, top 10, do you really want to be using a pick on a guy who missed a bunch of college time and then got hurt at his workout? And then this is what I talk about all the time with Joe Douglas, right? When I talk about the injuries on the O-line. I don't blame Joe Douglas for the injuries because he didn't draft guys who get injured. He drafted all these guys who were always healthy in college and they get hurt. Now, if Joe Douglas this year drafted Amarius Mims and Amarius Mims kept getting hurt as a pro, I'd be like, dude, you got to go. The red flags were there. He was hurt all the time in college. He got hurt at his combine. And then you drafted him, and guess what? Surprise, surprise, he's getting hurt here. So that's grounds to let a guy go. And yeah, NY Jets, he was absolutely, let's see, JetNation, what's Worthy like with the jam at the line? He was fine when I saw him, and I've watched a lot of Worthy. But again, probably the biggest concern with him is going to be that he's 165. I think he weighed in at 165. That will be a concern, but I can't remember his weight when the Jets signed him, but I remember when Robbie Anderson came along, and everyone was like, "This guy won't last as a pro. He's not strong enough, and he's too brittle. Look how thin he is. He's going to get hurt as a pro. He's not going to last." And Robbie Anderson, for an undrafted free agent, had a really nice career, still in the league. Saw him get on the field last year, called a bomb because that's what he does. So I remember watching Worthy and thinking, because this is, Robbie was still a Jet, if memory serves, back when I first watched Worthy, or he may have just left. And I thought this guy might be faster than Robbie Anderson. Like that's how quick he was. So he's got really good feet, and that's why you see him play, get good results as a punt return man. So Xavier Worthy is a guy. Sorry, we're getting off the Mims bandwagon or the Mims track, but I just saw the question there. But Mims, again, won with the physicals, didn't really win with the with beating the injury situation. Quarterback wise, just a guy I wanted to mention real quick to kind of give him his credit. He's had a good pre-draft process. It certainly seems. And that's one of Dylan's guys, Spencer Rattler, who I'd said I've discussed this a couple times where I commented on having said how good he looked at the beginning of this year, and would we, was it a fluke or would we see that carry over? Actually found that tweet. That was the final game last year. Watching his final game last year and then his first game this year, it did carry over. But Rattler, considering the fact he had very few weapons this year at South Carolina, Xavier Legette, who is an absolute monster. What a great receiver. Another great receiver class. But Spencer Rattler looked good at the combine. And, it sounds like teams are impressed with, what he's, coming away from their interviews and how he's looked. Hawk mentions Fatanu. He looks phenomenal. Go to the JetNation.com front page. You will find many player prospects, player profiles. Prospect profiles. We're putting scouting reports up. Myself, Dylan, Chris Schubert. I'll find that list for you right now while I'm talking, and just kind of give you an idea. If you go to the Jet Nation front page, and which scouting reports you'll be able to find. Here they are right here. So far on the Jet Nation front page, we have Talise Fuaga, we've got Fashanu, we've got Joe Alt. We wanted to do the top 3 tackles right away to kind of get those out of the way because we knew those were the guys who would generate the most conversation. Peyton Wilson, NC State linebacker. Anthony, we're gonna do guys who aren't first round prospects, folks. We love the draft process, and we love the sleepers, the small school guys, the UDFA, the guys who are not even projected to get picked. Like, we want to dig into those guys too and help inform the average fan who doesn't have the time to sit around and watch 5,000 college football games. So right now it's mostly big name guys. I would say Anthony Gould, the receiver from Oregon State, who also had himself a very good combine. He's not a guy that gets he's probably one of the few guys we did who isn't a sort of a top 2 or 3 round guy. But he's up there. JC Latham, who Chris Schubert just wrapped up. Dylan did Malachi Corley, the receiver from Western Kentucky. He's up there. Malik Mustafa, the Wake Forest safety, who I think could be a Jets target. And then you got Troy Fatanu from Washington, who's up there, along with Christian Mahogany, the guard from Boston College. Xavier Worthy did his the morning after the 40 because I thought, here's a guy that I've been watching and enjoying for a few years. A lot of folks may not be familiar with him. Let me go ahead and throw that out there. And I'm working on a Brock Bowers right now, so that'll be up in the next day or two. Bowers just absolutely would be a home run as far as I'm concerned. Let's see. What do we got here? JE, best receiver, Brian Thomas. Listen, every year we see these guys. Well, actually, I take that back. JE. I'm going to disagree only because of Marvin Harrison, but Brian Thomas too, I can completely see that. I just think Marvin Harrison Jr. is a freak of nature. His ability to bend, his ability to contort, his ability, the body control, the size-speed ratio is absolutely insane. The strength, his ability to attack the ball in the air, high point the football. I think he's a lock. I've heard Rick Spielman, the former Vikings GM, has referred to him as a Hall of Fame player. He believes he has a Hall of Fame trajectory. I could not disagree. Like, that's, and I'm not saying that I'm on par with an NFL GM. I'm just saying, every now and then you watch a guy pre-draft and you just say, you're not putting guys in the Hall of Fame. I'm not saying Marvin Harrison Jr. belongs in the Hall of Fame. I'm just saying when I watch him play, I'm like, that's what a Hall of Fame player looks like to me. And there's 2 guys I put in that class this year, the other one being Brock Bowers. And I'm doing the Brock Bowers profile. Mel Kiper mocked Brock Bowers to the Jets with the 2nd pick the other day. And a lot of people didn't like that because they keep saying tight end. What do you mean a tight end? We should take a tackle or a wide receiver. Here's why that doesn't make any sense to me. I can get on board with saying you need a tackle, you can't take a tackle, or you can't not take a tackle. You can't take Bowers. It has to be Fatanu. It has to be Olu, whatever. Okay. But to say you can't take a tight end, but take a receiver, either way, you're getting a pass catcher. But only one of those pass catchers lines up in line at tight end and can be a phenomenal blocker and improve your offensive line, who can also line up in the slot while winning on the outside. So to me, Bowers is so multidimensional and such a threat in so many different areas. He's a better pick than any of the receivers because the Jets need help on the O-line. So while you're not directly picking an O-lineman, you are improving your O-line by bringing him in. Joe Douglas always takes best available. JE, listen, everybody says that, right? Like, and I'm not saying that to be a jerk. I'm just saying, like, when was the last time a general manager said, yeah, we took the fourth best guy on our board? Like, you always say you take the best guy. And since we don't have access to their board, now I'm not saying he hasn't done that in the past. I'm just saying every GM says that. Every team says they do that. But as I've said, and this is why I knocked Joe Douglas last year. He did go best player. But that's why you drafted a guy who played like 18% of the snaps because you didn't need him. And that might pay off in future years. And I'm not saying the McDonald pick won't be a good one. I'm just saying for last year, it made no sense to me because you brought in Aaron Rodgers. It should have been all about win right now. Last year was not the year to draft guys who were going to help you 2 or 3 years from now. It should have been the entire focus should have been getting guys to help you immediately. And that was a huge fail on Joe Douglas's part. That pick should have been Jackson Smith-Njigba, who ended up putting up 700 yards or so in Seattle. Now, he wouldn't have with Zach in all likelihood, but had Rodgers stayed healthy, JSN was the perfect pick. The Jets reportedly didn't even have him as a first-round prospect, which is a little concerning because very good player. Let's see. Douglas always takes best available. Yeah, it was. Look, listen, Hawk, and listen, I'm a Joe D guy. I defend him, but I call him out for the dumb stuff. Like, not taking JSN was dumb. Giving up as much as you did for a 40-year-old quarterback with the injury risk was dumb. You literally traded you traded 4 snaps of Aaron Rodgers in exchange for a second-round pick. Given the fact Rodgers' age and the fact Rodgers was dinged up the previous year, the real protection in this deal would have been Joe Douglas saying, if Aaron doesn't play at least 10 games, you're getting a 4th-round pick. And then next year we can, like the following year, if he plays 10 or 12 games, then you get a 3, which really that would have been going too far. I many times pointed to the Favre deal where the Jets basically gave up a 4. So by Joe Douglas, and so the only point I'm making here is that with Joe Douglas, although I consider myself a Joe D guy and I defend some of what he does that other people don't, I sure as hell call him out on the dumb stuff. And not taking JSN I thought was dumb. Paying too much for Aaron Rodgers I thought was dumb. So Joe's got some things to learn from. And thank you, Hawk. I don't want to rehash the Aaron Rodgers thing, but if you listen to myself, Scott Mason, Play Like a Jet, we talked about it a million times. The Packers had no other buyers. None. If you have it, and they had to get rid of him. They weren't doing it to be nice. They were doing it because he had a $1 billion cap hit and a young quarterback who was ready. They had to trade him. And they had one buyer. I mean, if I'm buying something off of you that I know you have to sell and nobody else wants it, and I do, I'm offering you pennies. What else are you going to do? You can't keep it. Nobody else wants it except me. So you take what I offer. So again, Joe D dropped the ball on that one. Don't want to rehash that. This is combine prospect stuff, but it's so frustrating. And listen, if Rodgers wins the Super Bowl, I'm not going to give a damn. But until that happens, it's always going to irk me to see how much they gave up. I'll talk about some other combine guys who did well, and not even necessarily a spot where the Jets will be looking. At least not where this guy is going to get drafted. But Chop Robinson out of Penn State, running in the 4.4s. What a great day for him. He's a guy that jumps out on film. I think probably 2 years ago when I really noticed him, and a guy who I just mentioned, another defensive player who I just met. As I said, I wrote his draft prospect profile a couple weeks ago. Peyton Wilson, running the 4.44 in Indy at linebacker, off-ball linebacker, NC State. Injury history is a red flag. Age is a little bit of a flag. Age doesn't bother me as much as it does some people. I hear people say, like, oh, that guy's 24. That guy's 25. Okay, so if you draft him in the 2nd round and he has 8 to 10 productive years, is that a problem? Like, yes, you would love a guy with 15 years to play, 12, 13, 14 years to play. But is it the worst thing in the world if you draft a guy and he gives you 8 good seasons? I would take that every time, especially when you consider, right? We thought Leonard Taylor, agreed. JE says Leonard Taylor is a good player. I apologize. I gotta try to get less distracted by the chat, but I try to include everybody because people want to talk, and I'm thrilled that you guys are here on a Thursday night to talk football, talk draft, and talk Jets. So I don't want to be ignoring people, but sticking to the topic, yeah, we've seen enough guys. Like if you just look at the draft historically, the miss rate in the draft is so much higher than I think fans realize. We did this a couple months ago. We broke down every single Joe Douglas draft pick, and we put it on a scale. We found an article where someone had taken the time to break down, I think it was 18 years worth of drafts, categorize each player like anywhere from complete waste, throwaway of a pick, guy never suited up, guy never stepped on the field, all the way up to 1% all pro Hall of Fame type. And it's right in line with what I've heard other GMs discuss, where they say, and I've heard a couple of general managers say it, the best general managers in the NFL hit on just under 50% of their picks. Like, I think fans fall so in love with the big names, or they look at like the outlier draft classes and think, oh, look, that team found 5 picks in that class. Why can't we do that? That is not the norm. The norm is 1 or 2 starters and 1 or 2 backups that that have long careers. I don't mean guys who start for a year and then they're out of the league, or who are backup for a year or two and then they're out of the league. I'm talking about guys who play through their first contract and maybe more as a starter or a backup. You get 1 or 2 of each in the average draft class. So I don't know what people expect. So when I hear something like, Peyton Wilson is 24, 25, he's, and I think, okay. And so if he gives you 8 good seasons, and listen, we spoke to Peyton Wilson in Mobile, myself and Dylan, and he talked about how he spends 10, 12 plus hours a week watching film, and how, Luke Kuechly, the former great linebacker, is a mentor of his. They talk about the importance of study and preparation. You watch him on game day, and it's not the least bit surprising that Peyton Wilson, the level he works at, the way he's able to react so quickly, and then he's got the physical to go along with it. So when you're reacting quickly and then you have the physical to get you there, which he does with his quickness, speed, explosion. Peyton Wilson's a guy who the biggest, again, the only true red flag he has that would give me pause drafting a guy like that is the medical history. But we have seen him now play a full season for NC State last year. And that was, his decision. He wanted to prove to teams before entering the draft that he could play a full year and stay healthy, and he did that. So he's a guy who won out at the combine. Let's see, Wild Wave. Why wasn't Puka taken in the first? Everyone, exactly. That's the thing, and obviously nobody had Puka there. I hate to mention Ozzie Newsome all the time, but the reason I do it is because he's so great, right? Like, here's a Hall of Fame GM, and when I see some of the things we say about general managers, Ozzie Newsome acknowledged he had a stretch in his career where he went about 3 years, like just 3 consecutive really bad drafts. Now, granted, he's Ozzie Newsome, so he had enough of an established history that he can get away with that. But if Hall of Fame GMs can have 3, we're talking like 20 plus bad picks in a row, isn't every GM going to have a run where things don't go that well? And the answer to that is yes. As far as Puka goes, yeah. Oh, that was the point I was making about Ozzie. You mentioned Puka getting taken, not going in the first round. The year Tom Brady went, he won 199th very famously. Everyone knows that number. The Ravens were going to use a late round pick on a quarterback, and they took Chris Redman. Like, the Hall of Fame, arguably best GM in my lifetime, took Chris Redman over Tom Brady. So it's, people say, why didn't the Jets take Brady? Well, they took Pennington earlier in that class. There was the book years ago that claimed there was a scout in the room that told Parcells, we really got to take this kid Brady out of Michigan. He's still on the board in the 4th, 5th round. And Parcells like, no, we just used to pick on a quarterback. We're not taking another one. We're not taking another one. So the Ravens too, again, we're looking for a quarterback, and they chose Chris Redman over Tom Brady. So look, I know everyone likes to be an expert and all that, but the draft is about 1,000,000 times harder than people seem to want to acknowledge. I think that covers all of that. I'm sorry about that. I'm just looking at the draft prospect profiles we put up. And yeah, so a couple of people mentioned Brian Thomas. He ran a 4.33. I would not be one bit surprised if he ended up being a top, if he ended up being the second best receiver in this class. Jacob Cowing helped himself. Didn't look as good at the Senior Bowl as I'd hoped. And that's not to say he looked bad. I just had very high hopes for him because I've liked Cowing for a couple years now. So seeing him go out and run a 4.38 was very encouraging. Same for Jalen Wright, um, and Trey Benson right there with him, 4.39. Sorry. Jalen Wright, running back from Tennessee, Trey Benson, running back from Florida State, ran 4.38 and 4.39 respectively. Now, one thing we've seen from Joe Douglas is that every single year he takes he's taking a running back. Let's see. Let's see. Anthony says reaching two fireable things. Anthony, you say fireable, but that's to you fireable. Like maybe an owner is looking at it the way I'm looking at it as a fan and saying, Jesus, those are some horrible, horrible mistakes. But you've done enough good that I'm going to hope you learn from the mistakes and we minimize those and keep doing the good. Like fireable if you haven't done anything else right, yeah, fine. Like you got to go. But it's another fireable offense. That term gets thrown around so often. When in all reality, how do you expect? I mean, we say all the time, right? Like players need time to develop. Like GMs aren't perfect at their jobs either. I just said Ozzie Newsome had three years of bad drafts in a row, which he said himself. And I would argue most owners don't know football. Owners are billionaires who know business, and they think, you know what? I can afford a football team. That would be super cool to talk about at parties, and they buy football teams. How many NFL owners, can break down X's and O's? Jerry Jones. Jerry Jones played college football, and Jerry Jones actually. Side note, in that same article that I mentioned a little while ago, where they broke down draft classes year by year, another article popped up with that over the past like 15, 20 years. Jerry Jones, the Cowboys have had the best success in the draft in terms of like what percentage of their players have panned out. So again, maybe something to do with that. So yeah, I think you need some stability. And if you have a GM who has shown that he can find good players, which Joe Douglas has, and again, no, he hasn't shown he can do it 100% of the time. And he's made some bad decisions. He should have done better at tackle last year. I've said that. I didn't hate the fact that, they had AVT who they felt could play tackle, and then Schweitzer who could fill in if AVT had to move the tackle. But then when when the starter and then AVT and then his backup all get hurt, then that's not a good situation. Explain how you groom Huff, lose Huff when his path didn't have to happen. I talked about it a little while ago, Anthony. I said it's a bad situation with Huff. You should have signed him last year, and now there's a chance that when you go shopping in free agency next year, you get nothing for him. It's a fail on his part. Exactly. I'm not disagreeing. I'm not sitting here saying he's perfect. I'm just saying if you can do enough good in that job as a general manager, then I'm going to cut you some slack and hope you learn from your mistakes. Versus, well, let me fire this guy and go out and find another dude who might not even be able to do the things well that he's done. We've seen him go out and pay nothing to bring in JFM. JFM was a guy anyone could have had. Joe Douglas brought him in. Anyone could have had Quincy Williams. Joe Douglas brought him in. Found himself a starter at safety in Tony Adams, who I think is going to be a good player. So there's been some good UDFAs. There's been some development, and I believe that guys like Jeremy Ruckert, guys like Izzy Abanikanda, I think in different situations we would be seeing them have a bigger impact. But as it stands, if you want to knock Joe Douglas, I think the Robert Saleh hiring wasn't very good. Let's see. Well, it's a great question, Anthony, and I've talked about this before, and it's kind of why I give Joe a little bit more leeway than I would others. I think he is the GM. He's running the team, but I have no doubt. I said it before. I think Joe Douglas last year put together a 46 or 47 man roster, and then he had to go out and get 6-7 guys that Aaron Rodgers liked. And I've said he needs to reclaim his job. Like, fine, you want your best buddy in Bakhtiari, we'll bring him in. But there's not going to be that Dalvin Cook signing screamed Aaron Rodgers because it was so antithetical to what Joe Douglas does and believes. Going out and paying $7-8 million for a washed-up vet at the most disposable position in the NFL. But you saw Aaron Rodgers buddying up with Cook when they brought him in for the visit. Aaron Rodgers spent how many years playing against Dalvin Cook, watching him run wild, and probably had some very nice things to say and said, let's get this guy in here. Because it was so backwards from everything we know of Joe Douglas. So I think Joe Douglas was told, or I think when Aaron Rodgers comes in, ownership makes it clear. Like, look, we got our guy, make him happy. If there's somebody he wants, bring him. And I've had people argue with me on this. I've had people tell me, no, I think Joe Douglas genuinely wanted Randall Cobb. No. Billy Turner, Randall Cobb, Dalvin Cook, Tim Boyle, another Rodgers buddy. There's no way. The only guy you can make somewhat of a case that Joe Douglas may have pursued him was Alan Lazard. And listen, Lazard had a terrible season, but he wasn't terrible in Green Bay. Before free agency started, there were plenty of outlets, plenty of prognosticators and websites who had Alan Lazard listed as the top free agent receiver on the market, and that was a need for the Jets. So whether or not Aaron Rodgers was coming, I think they would have at least kicked the tires on Lazard. Once it was clear that they knew, like, look, we're getting Aaron Rodgers, that probably, lit the fire a little more to really go after him. But yes, I think Joe Douglas, yeah, he's the GM, but I think that it's been made clear to him that when Aaron wants something, get him that something. And that's what they've done, and I think it came back to bite them in the behind. Let's see. Why didn't they pivot? Well, I actually noticed a line, Anthony, in Zach Rosenblatt's article this week. And if you look at, there are a couple things going on there. One, and again, this is another area where I was critical of Joe Douglas. I was critical of Joe Douglas during the offseason. It may have even been before they got Rodgers. Whenever it was well before the season started. And I tweeted out that it would be malpractice for Joe Douglas and the Jets to not go out and get a second quarterback because you were leaving open the possibility of Zach Wilson having to play quarterback on a Super Bowl contender, which is what the Jets were. And that's exactly what happened. But I also, because the move was so, for any general manager, not just Joe Douglas, for a general manager to go out and say, I'm going to replace my quarterback because he's not good enough, but then keep the guy who's not good enough as his backup, makes so little sense. I said all along, I think, again, this was something probably from upstairs where they said between the picks and the money for Aaron, the spending what we spent on Zach, like we've gone so heavy at quarterback, we're not going to let you sign another $7, $8, $9, $10 million guy to back up Aaron. So make it work. Find a veteran who knows the offense, and that's your backup. And I think that's where the Tim Boyle thing came in. And then in a piece he wrote the other day, Zach Rosenblatt kind of mentioned it in passing, but it jumped out at me because and listen, maybe it's been reported and I just missed it, but I've not seen it reported anywhere. I've said it myself a million times, but Zach Rosenblatt said in his piece the other day, talking about the offseason, the team wasn't prepared to let Douglas spend on a backup quarterback, having just traded for Rodgers. And I thought, well, that's been my, conspiracy theory all this time. And now, seeing it writing the other day, that would make sense. There are people on the team who control the money who, Joe Douglas gets to do what he gets to do. But that doesn't mean there aren't people above him who can say, Joe, we're not signing off on that one. You did this, you did that. Okay. We're not signing off on that. And that's what I had always guessed had happened. And Zach Rosenblatt said just the other day, going into the season, the Jets were not willing to let Douglas spend on another quarterback, given what they just spent to get Rodgers and what they'd spent to get Zach. So why didn't he pivot from there? I think they were going to give Zach a couple of weeks to see how he looked. And then if you look, a lot of quarterbacks in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the year got hurt and teams went to their backups. And it's like, damn it, you thought you might have had a shot at a Gardner Minshew or Jacoby Brissett or something like that. So I think what the Jets would have liked to have done is run Zach out there for 4 or 5 weeks. And if he crashed and burned, you go get somebody else. As it turned out, they won a couple games, but other teams' quarterbacks started going down, and then there really wasn't an option. Again, if you're not willing to spend the money and the cheap guys aren't available, there's not a lot else there. And Anthony, don't worry. Look, Anthony saying he doesn't want to be Debbie Downer. We all get there at some point with this team. And who can blame us, right, with what we've been through. So I think I've covered most of. Let's throw out a couple more names from the combine before we wrap things up. Theo Johnson from Penn State. He was a guy. If you watched our coverage in Mobile, myself and Dylan Terraman, he was a guy who looked far more athletic than I'd imagined. I thought, big target, physical, athletic enough, but seeing him in and out of his breaks during individuals, during one on ones, we kind of all looked at each other and said, "This guy, this guy can really move, not just north south, but quick feet, able to get open." And I think he's a player who's going to be, sometimes we pick out these guys and you feel like this guy's going to be a better pro than he was a collegian. And I think Theo Johnson fits into that category. And I think I wanted to Lad McConkey, of course. He was a guy. I wanted to touch on a couple more receivers. Lad McConkey and Roman Wilson ran identical 4.39s. And Lad McConkey was a guy who I've discussed and said, I'm guilty of writing that dude off because he played at Georgia. And I watched Georgia games and I saw him put up these numbers and he just didn't pop to me. And I'm thinking, you know what? He's another dude playing on a loaded roster where everybody's open because everybody's better than the guy across from him. So it's just kind of easier for him. But then the week leading up to, the couple weeks or whatever, leading up to Mobile, I watched him more closely. And I said that to the guys when we arrived in Alabama. We were talking prospects before we got to the practices. And I said, Lad McConkey. I was like, I was wrong on that dude. Like, I just thought he's a guy, he's an okay player on a great team. And I was like, I'm really interested in seeing him. And he looked fantastic in Mobile. And he had himself a really good combine. Same goes for Roman Wilson. Thing that jumped out to me, during the season, the last couple of years at Michigan, really tough guy. Didn't seem, I didn't, 4.39, I did not see coming. But he did. He blew it out of the water. Really nice job there. A lesser known guy, and I won't do this tonight because I'm gonna wait till we're all here till it's me, Dylan, and Chris. We're gonna come on. We're gonna pick 3 or 4 guys. We're gonna use like the PFN player ranking, prospect ranking, and we're gonna pick dudes outside the top 300, outside the top 400, guys who are probably, at least if according to PFN anyway, going to be undrafted free agents. And it doesn't mean they will. The example I use all the time is Michael Clemens. A couple of years ago, and I get Clemens hasn't lit the world on fire as a Jet, but I watched him on film and I thought this dude's pretty good. Like, this guy's a mid-rounder, maybe late rounder. And then I look him up on PFN and he was like the 600th or 700th ranked player. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. And I kind of thought, well, I guess I don't know what the hell I'm looking at because they're telling me this guy's not even a UDFA prospect. And he got picked. And Cordell Flott was another one. Those 2 guys that year who I really like. So PFN doesn't always get it right. But we're going to pick a few guys outside the top 300 or 400 who we really like. And I think this will be one of my guys, or at least he'll be getting consideration. LaDatrick Griffin, the Mississippi State receiver, ran a 4.43, had himself a really nice combine. He had a game against, I can't remember. I watched it last year. He had like a 200 and some yard game. And again, not playing in the greatest situation in terms of quarterback play, but I think he might be a guy who can get drafted or make a roster. Cornelius Johnson out of Michigan ran a 4.44. He's a guy that I was surprised wasn't in Mobile. I really thought he'd be there. Another guy, Cole Bishop, safety out of Utah. There's a few safeties in this class. Not a deep safety class, but there are 3 or 4 guys that sort of almost, I'm not saying they're the same player, but the thing that jumps out at me, and I'm talking about Malik Mustafa. I'm talking about Evan Williams. I'm talking about Jordan Hicks. Evan Williams, I think I just said him. These guys are always in the right place, always around the ball, always seem to be making a play, whether it's breaking a pass up or getting to the receiver as the ball arrives and preventing any yards after the catch. Really, those guys, there's like 3, 4, 5 guys who I would be happy with in this class. Ricky Pearsall, I just scrolled past. I'm not even sure if I said his name, but he's another one. I got some old tweets on that guy. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before. Made an incredible diving catch, running at a 45-degree angle toward the sideline on a ball that was lofted over his shoulder. He laid out and hauled it in. And right away, I'm like, this guy's on my radar. And so I've watched Ricky Pearsall the last couple of years, really liked him going into the draft process. And he's been absolutely phenomenal. Again, I said it before, fantastic receiver class, which is just kind of becoming the norm. Jalen Simpson, Auburn, played some corner, played some safety at Auburn, a little bit of a ball hawk. I like him. I like him as a late round guy. Luke McCaffrey, I had the chance to interview him in Mobile. Humble kid, dad, Ed, of course, played for the Broncos, the Giants. And we all know Christian, but he had himself a really nice day, ran a 4.46. And the thing that's exciting about Luke McCaffrey is the fact that he's got so little experience. He played quarterback at Stanford, where I saw him and I thought this guy's not going to be a pro. Then he goes to Rice, switches to wide receiver, and all of a sudden you're seeing him make ridiculous catches, take huge hits, hang on to the football. Talk to him about that when I interviewed him in Mobile. If you go back and watch I think it may be like the last drive, very late in the game, Rice versus Texas. McCaffrey has this touchdown catch where he just gets blown up, helmet falls off, and he just hops right up and he holds on for the touchdown. So he's a guy who is having himself, again, another guy who's having a really good pre-draft process, and a mid-round type guy who I would think fourth, fifth round based on what we saw from him. Kalen DeLoach, Florida State. I haven't talked about him in a little while, but I did mention him several months ago on the season or during the season. He's a guy who just modern day linebacker. Even if he's not an every down guy, you keep him in to spy a quarterback because he can run. And those were my thoughts watching him at FSU. He goes into the combine, he runs a 4.47, and it's like there's that ability to move. And we saw it against Louisville last year when I watched that game. Saw it again a couple times this year. So Kalen DeLoach, day 3 guy. Garendo, I've watched a couple of his games. Actually, who did I watch? It might have been FSU. I watched Louisville against, I forget who it was. And Garendo, right away, you think this, super athletic, really explosive, not the biggest guy, not much of a workload. Like, that's a little concerning. Not that you're going to bring him in to be a 25 carry a game guy, because those don't exist anymore anyway. But yeah, I think Garendo is going to be a gem. He can catch the football. He can run really well, and was one of the faster backs down in Indy. Mike Sainistril, 4.47. I thought he'd be like sub 4.45. Mike Sainistril, converted wide receiver who Michigan moved to corner last year, and like within a couple of games, you're just seeing him make plays, and you're like, that guy was a receiver like a few weeks ago or the previous year. And Mike Sainistril did a really nice job at nickel. I would love for the Jets to add him. I know they don't have a nickel, but he's just I hate saying it because it's so dumb. All these guys are football players, but sometimes there are just some guys you look at and go, that guy's a football player. And Mike Sainistril, cornerback from Michigan, played a little outside, played nickel. And again, this is after moving from wide receiver, just very instinctive, made plays on the ball. And he's the type of guy who should only get better in the coming years, again, given his lack of experience at the position heading into the year. Cam Hart from Notre Dame, myself, Dom C. If you're following Dom C, check him out on Twitter. He's doing his Project Prospect podcast. We both talked about Cam Hart while we were down there in Mobile. He did a really nice job, and I said to Dom, talking about him, I felt like Cam Hart was a guy who didn't come out last year but was getting a lot of love. Like, if he had, people were talking about him like he was going to be an early rounder. He didn't come out. He goes back to school and had a kind of a quiet year and seems to have fallen off people's radars. But I think he's a guy who can play. And one more guy I wanted to mention before going. Again, not sure the Jets are gonna take a running back, and actually I think I mentioned him a couple weeks ago. Bucky Irving out of Oregon. Didn't run as fast as I thought he would, but he runs with a little more power than I expected when I first started watching him. Again, catches the ball well, picks up the blitz. Guy that won't have to come off the field. And this is coming from I'm an Izzy Abanikanda guy. Loved him at Pitt. Really wanted the Jets to take him. Was thrilled when they did. Wish we saw him more last year. We didn't, obviously. But he's a guy I think is going to, who will be a part of the Jets' plans moving forward. But as I've said, Joe Douglas has taken a back. If I'm not mistaken, he's taken one every year. If not more than, hasn't skipped more than one. You took P. Ryan, you took Brees, you took Izzy, and I feel like there was somebody else. I'm off the top of my head. Someone's slipping my mind right now. But Joe Douglas likes taking backs. He wants to have a pipeline of running backs. Now, could we see that change this year with the lack of picks? Perhaps. But that's where, again, That's where a trade in or trade down comes into play. And I've been saying for some time now that trading down really should be. Oh yeah, of course, Michael Carter. There you go. Thanks, Jim. I knew there was somebody in there who I wasn't remembering. So they've taken it back every year. I would expect them to take one this year. And Michael Carter, another guy who left here and played better. And I get it. He didn't get a ton of carries in Arizona. But when he did get carries, he looked better than he did with the Jets. Because every offensive player that leaves this team looks better when they move on. It's just the rule. CJ Uzama probably going to have a 400 or 500 yard season this next season after putting up, 100 and whatever this year. Guys just play better when they leave here. Offensive guys anyway. Different story on the defensive side of the ball. So those are some of the winners from the Combine. That's some chat about potential trades for the Jets. Again, if you're Joe Douglas, get on the phone with the Broncos. Get Foley Fatukasi back in here. Free agency, the Jets, I've said it before, I think the overwhelming majority of their shopping of their time is going to be spent in the bargain bin. By that, of course, I mean late, second, third wave free agency guys. That first wave, I'd be shocked. Or let's say I would be very surprised if we see them bring in more than one or two big ticket guys. I think it'll be one. I think we'll see one really big contract and then a couple of sort of maybe mid-high level contracts and then bargain shopping after that. With the draft is like, we're about 50 days away, give or take, maybe 48, maybe 51, I don't know. But what is that, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 7.5 weeks, something like that? Draft, I'll tell you what, folks, I will tell you this. Now that I have a bit more time on my hand and I watch a billion college football games to try to have as much information on these players as I can, the draft used to feel like it took forever. Now I feel like the season ends and I have like 10 minutes to get ready to talk about the draft because we really dig in and we try to have as much information available as possible for as many questions that we might encounter. And that'll do it. Thanks so much for engaging in the chat, guys. Much appreciated. Part of the fun of doing this is that we're going to disagree from time to time, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you did too. So that'll wrap this one up, Jets fans. Have a good one. We will be back. Might sneak in a couple shows between now and next Wednesday. But that's going to wrap this one up. Have a good one, Jets fans.